those projects that they were actually proposing that art is a practice that researches, but also that this research is or has some sort of dimension that you need to exhibit. But at the end of the day, all those exhibitions never took place in the main hall. They took place somewhere else. So even if we were stressing that, we were not doing it. So, and that split, that was on the one hand a very positive thing, because we were actually supporting, giving money, helping, listening, absorbing those that they were doing research. Actually, this separation was becoming very irritating. And then I start to think, why is kind of irritating me? Why I'm so irritated when people is saying that art is a production of knowledge? Probably because the word production, it kind of implies something that has nothing to do of how actually knowledge comes about or what originates knowledge. That's on the one hand. Then it's a question of knowledge itself, like why do we need to stress the question of knowledge, and why do we need to stress the question of knowledge in relationship with the production of art? And then also, why do we need to separate those exhibitions or those efforts from other exhibitions and other efforts? What do we need to make that distinction? What do we need to say that? Why does it not come naturally to that? In the case of Spain, it was a clear answer. So because the exhibitions in the main building of MACBA were also research-based exhibitions, but they were mostly encompassing artworks with a little bit of documentation around, they were separated from those other exhibitions that they were only kind of material or documentation. So that was kind of the argument that the museum used, or we used, to tell ourselves that this was a good thing. That it was for the sake of preserving a space for those artworks that actually needed or could have this kind of knowledge context, but then to implement, to add, to put that footnote of other material in the next building, and so on and so forth. But it was some sort of political story that very seldom gets explained, which is that because of Franco and because of what's actually happening now, because of the many problems that lead to a misunderstanding in between the different communities that form the cultural community of Spain and Catalonia, it was very important at that time for the MACBA, for the Museum of Contemporary Art of Barcelona, to kind of surpass the idea of a canonical collection. Of course, they could not, because of the question of money. I think you could not have certain works because you cannot afford them, but also I think, I wish, that the museum in itself was already founded or grounded in an idea that should actually go beyond that idea of a collection, and was actually collecting without the senses. So it was a collection that was not used one organ, and that organ was experience. So it was somehow a collection based or kind of in contradiction to the notion of taste, and was posing as a main goal a collection that could actually be based on another organ, and that organ was the brain, but not the brain as in thinking brain, but the brain as in memory brain. So the most important thing for that museum was to collect those works that could produce a new collective memory that would then give rise to a different political and a different attitude in the audience, in the press, in the art historians, and so on and so forth. So this question of the organs, like a collection without taste, not a collection based in aesthetic experience, but a political and aware collection, was kind of putting lots of interesting questions to me, like, needless to say that at that time I was an incredible believer that this was, and I think it still is, a really interesting exercise and a very, very important one. But then, going back to my idea of why I was uncomfortable when people saying that art is the production of knowledge, is the question of attributes. Every time that everyone was saying that art is the production of knowledge, we were kind of saying that art needs attributes that is lacking, that there is some sort of things missing that aesthetics or the traditional way of defining aesthetics in itself cannot give to us. And therefore we need some other attributes, and we were using knowledge as one attribute. Art is not only that object that produces some sort of feelings or some sort of experience into the viewer, but is producing knowledge. It's an extra attribute that would add to an attribute that was historically located in art, but would then respond to the new situation, a new geographical, geopolitical situation, the post-colonial condition, the question of gender, everything could then be explained with this new attribute, the attribute of knowledge. And then I was thinking that it was a little bit like, it was some sort of a transitional moment. On the one hand, it was kind of fundamental to say so. It was fundamental to say that the collection could not only be a collection to produce sentiments or to produce aesthetic experiences, but could be also a collection to produce a new memory, a memory that is not a memory of the past. Don't get it wrong, it's not a memory that remembers the past of, for example, Spanish art, or remembers the past of Catalan art, or remembers the past of European art, or remembers, but it remembers the future as well. It remembers the possibilities of what remembering and memory could be in relationship to identity building, and the question of actually how do you relate to the things that you have and the things that you don't have. Also, the ideas that you think that you possess and ideas that you should possess, and so on and so forth. So I thought that that was like interesting. But on the other hand, I was always surprised that this question of knowledge was like having a third leg, or like having a third eye, or like having more ears. Like it was like this all was expressing that we needed to grow, that the organs of art and experience was not enough, and then we were adding the brain. And adding the brain is a little bit of a problem because we were adding the brain in an old-fashioned way. So we were not adding an interesting brain, or a brain that is actually making and thinking a little bit ahead or differently from the Cartesian brain, but was a very traditional brain. So we were adding to something that we thought was missing and lacking, but perhaps was not. Because nobody actually said or can think that experience is anything if it's not the brain in itself. But somehow this split, the idea of the split of the brain from the organs or from other organs, was already present in expressing that art is knowledge. So I was starting thinking that what if, or what actually can we not gather together some sort of collective effort to think how art is intelligence? How are we a little bit more ambitious than proposing just knowledge, which is a possibility inside thinking? I think not every thinking is a knowledgeable thinking. Knowledge is just one part of the way that we relate to the real. I think, of course, we are articulated versus curiosity, and we want to know, and then that's what we call knowledge when we actually get to know. So the idea of getting to know something, this control freakiness, is very operative at the core of knowledge. So this is one part, but it's not the total. So if we already are as bold as saying that art is knowledge, what can we not say that art is intelligence? And if art is intelligence, the next question is how? How is art intelligence? And then, if art is intelligence, what do we mean when we say that art is intelligence? And then it's really, really ambitious, because if we are saying that art is intelligence, it means that it needs also to operate, to organically relate, to function, to have some sort of articulation, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering why actually we were not kind of going towards it. So that was like the main point that I have been trying to deal in the last years. Like when I was working in the Documenta, all my writing and my work was about the idea of reverting sense. Because art was knowledge, and I started to be interested in the nonsensical. I was interested in these kind of exercises, many historical exercises made by many artists, that they were trying to actually not get trapped into language, but also not into language, because language, like knowledge, is one part. It's like a bottle, but the bottle is not only the only thing that you can define milk. So the question is, if you are interested in milk, how many bottles can you have, or how many different ways of encompassing that you could get? So that was kind of the first step. And then I little by little recognized in myself that I was unable to reach what I wanted, that I was actually trying to surpass some of the uneasiness that I did have, not only with the idea of the production of knowledge, but with the idea that many of the curatorial practices related, and many of the artistic practices as well, but I'm talking about the curators because that's how I did approach my text and my practice, they were all the time relating to the institutional life of art. That many of the debates in the last 2 decades, that they were dealing with the production of knowledge, they were dealing with the production of knowledge in a very particular context of restating that knowledge inside those existing institutions. And on the other hand, I was thinking that it makes complete sense to talk about institutions, to talk about how art appears in the public, because the public appearance of art mostly happens in different kinds and natures of institutions. So it was a matter of responsibility and a matter of rendering transparent the systems in which we are operative that motivated that many people was talking all the time about the white cube, about the grammar, about the possibilities, about the impossibilities, about reinserting, about not forgetting, about remembering, and all that was kind of linked together. And it was, for me, a fundamental part of the late 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, exactly understanding this forming of the institutions. But this was also the forming of the public responsibility of the public money. And now that we are dramatically losing it, we are kind of getting into a complete different stage. The stage of property collectors and the private money also taken into that public systems. So I wanted to just explain a couple of projects where I was kind of experiencing or speculating with this idea of what if art is intelligence, and if art is intelligence, could it be conceived as an organ? And if art is an organ, like an organ that kind of encompasses all other organs, what is the relationship that this organ has to other organs and to the question of the subject? In other words, can we think not only in art relating to subjects, but art relating to the production of a complete new sensorium, a complete new perception of the real? And if this is thinkable, I think if we could understand that the art practices, or some of the art practices that are very interesting today, and they are very speculative, are this kind of investigative drive towards the question of intelligence. How do they relate to technology? How do they relate to science? How do they relate to many other disciplines, if you want, that they are kind of driven by similar forces? And then the next question is, how can we produce situations, and how can we actually produce even exhibitions, of course, that would kind of convey a little bit that in other institutions, like normal museums, that are actually not made for this kind of speculative thinking. And they actually are still very possessed by this grammar of the possibilities and impossibilities, of the barriers, of the attributes of what defines our public space and what defines what is acceptable as an art practice and what is a little bit freaky or uncommercial or off. So in other words, if art is intelligence, it would be very difficult to relate to all these walls in the sense of alterity. Nothing would be alternative to anything else, even if they coexist. Our major goal as curators or as producers or as artists would be exactly to try to find more and more ways of making these things coexist. So I'm gonna give some examples because that perhaps makes that all easier. I started working I started to be very interested in a guy called Federico Manuel Peralta Ramos, that was an Argentinian artist, and then he kind of won some sort of national prize in '68 with a work that is called We Are Outside, Nosotros Afuera, and it's a gigantic egg. I need to go. So this is the work. This work was presented with an oil painting next to the egg, kind of gigantic egg, and the painting was mandarina is like an orange, but it's smaller than an orange. You know what it is, like mandarin. So the cosmic orange, so to say, and that was presented next to the egg, and then he says we are outside. And then after that, he stopped doing art. And I explained that many times and I wrote a text about it. I was completely intrigued by it. A very good friend of mine, the director of the Ditela Institute in Argentina, told me about him. And the fact that after that moment, he stopped producing works of art as such, as objects, and started some sort of television program that was running for many, many years in national television of Argentina. He did a record called I'm a Piece of the Atmosphere. And then he also started to meet people and give them advice. So you would go and sit in La Florida, which is a cafe in Buenos Aires, and then you would know that he's there. He was kind of a celebrity. And then he was receiving people, and then you would talk a little bit, chat a little bit with him, and then he would kind of write a sentence in a small paper to you that was some of summarizing his wisdom. So some sort of tautology many times. So I was completely interested by the fact that no battery? Yes, it's back. So for many people, Federico was perceived as an artist that was stopping doing art. So he was on television, and they thought that he kind of stopped his career as an artist and was not starting as anything else. And then I was very intrigued by the egg and the fact that the egg was the kind of end point of a certain way of understanding his career, and that he went into another media that was very expansive, doing a television program that was very freaky, where he kind of was playing the gordo, the big person, the fat person, addressing the nation in nonsensical ways, in something that, of course, had a tradition in theater and in performance, but was made on purpose somehow, if you think of the background of Argentina and the junta militar of that time. So it was interesting that somebody in a very complicated political time of its country kind of abandoned certain practice to go to another media and to some sort of merge in a complete different way with the rest of the nation. So I'm not going to go in details about that story and what I think about the egg, and the egg being the beginning of life, and the idea of the egg being actually a hard drive full of information, and the idea that to be both an egg and a piece of atmosphere refers very strongly to the question of intelligence and to that kind of ambition. And to my thesis that Federico Manuel did not want it to disappear, but his ambition just was even bigger than an aesthetic ambition and was somewhere else, where he could just produce a complete different substance that was kind of acting in a complete different manner as an artist and could not be described on the one hand, so it was problematic because it was very difficult to then describe him as an artist, and second, it could really not be encompassed. I think it was just all over. It did not have any limits, so he was not an artist anymore because the limits of his practice were not there. So some sort of, like in that moment, I started to see that idea of both intelligence and both the ocean. So this idea of something that is kind of has no limits, that it has no borders in an interesting way, that is more of a substance and less of a reality, or what we call reality. So I was talking before the talk with with a group. We were talking about David Gruber. So I started to work with lots with scientists and with artists. I was surrounded by many artists that they were telling me that they were doing a performance where they wanted to propose that they were a turtle, like Eduardo Navarro, or Ingela Irman that was doing an impressive performance becoming a frog. But actually, I would show a picture of that. Or many. I think there is many artists that they were kind of addressing that kind of new sensorium, so to say. So on the one hand, if somebody tells you that they are or they want to become a turtle, the first thing is that you could think is that they want to impersonate a turtle, that they could be, they are going to dress up as a turtle to do something. But what Eduardo was proposing is actually try as hard as he could to become a turtle, like try to understand, but then you could think, this guy is just proposing a change of perspective, but then he would reply that actually not. He was not interested in the perspective of a turtle, but he was interested in a complete challenge to his sentiment, to the whole feeling of being human. And the same was with Ingela Irman. That has nothing to do with Argentina and is working in Stockholm. And she was proposing a series, like a big series of performances where she was being a plant and acting as a plant. That's the frog. And then she was also doing, how to read all that? So, you know, you could think, oh, it's anecdotal, but more and more, many artists were actually interested in this new thing, or in this kind of, I don't know how to call it, this totally inside something else. And this something else has not to do with art. And I started to relate it with the question of the egg and the question of intelligence. And then I was kind of like following those practices, and I've been interested in how scientists, for example, and our notions of artificial intelligence and the notions of how to relate to technology, how do we see ourselves in relationship with the future, with the idea of production, how these things entangle. And I came across, thanks to a friend, with several scientists, and one group of them, led by David Gruber, was doing an experiment for many years that now he could prove more or less, which was to construct the first camera that was not following the optic nerve of a human, but actually was following the optic nerve of an animal, like a turtle in that case. So Gruber, which was not at all interested in consciousness or studies of consciousness or surpassing human consciousness, or the idea of how to perceive the world without a distance to reality, or how to actually address the question of panpsychism, for example. So he was just kind of an optician. He was interested in how a camera records the depth of the ocean. Was very intrigued by the fact that in traditional recordings of the sea, there's very few recordings of the deep waters, because in the deep waters there is no light, and our camera is based on our organ, which is the eye, and it's very difficult for our eye to see the light that is there. So on the one hand, the cameras historically were very unequipped to throw light into the depths, and they learned, and they could, like now they can, but still the light that you are kind of throwing there is intervening light. So it's not probably the light that is there. So intrigued by that, he started to analyze the eyes of different animals, and the one that he came closer to be able to replicate somehow, or thinking that he could replicate, was the eye of a turtle. And with the eye of a turtle, or with that information of how it operates, he did a camera, and with that camera he started to do recordings in the deep waters. And in the deep waters, with that camera, he discovered that there is a protein that is actually producing some sort of reaction in the skin of many animals, not all, in the deep waters, and is producing light, and that there is light. and the animals see those lights. And that this is a very differentiated environment. And then he started to, to see something which is some sort of a revolution, like the idea of seeing through the eye of somebody else. So we started some sort of debate group with some artists and with himself, trying to figure out if all those wanting to become turtles or plants or wanting these kind of things had any interest in relationship with the development of perception and the development of intelligence, not only human intelligence, but an intelligence that would then be able to articulate differently the relationships that exist, that they are there, but that we are unable to see because we can only see from our body and from our perception. So, one thing. So that's Ingela. Another interesting thing is that all these practices that I am talking about are tremendously crappy. So that there is nothing high-tech in the way that they are realized, and is an immense amount of research, of course, and an immense amount of information and knowledge, which is embedded into the possibility of at all being able to do that. And that also intrigued me, because I think that institutions as they are now, it's very difficult to absorb this kind of research. And it's even difficult to absorb this kind of practice. And that this is actually even easier to convince different institutions like the MIT to work with those artists and to convince a museum. And in that polemic or in that problem, I also kind of was, it was triggering the same problems that I was talking at the beginning of my talk. The same problems that we did have 10 years ago by including some sort of formats into other sort of formats, or this idea of excluding certain practices from other practices because they don't seem to possess the same sort of entity that art should have. They are kind of very unstable. And it's particularly that quality of being super unstable, the fact that they are kind of transitioning through an investigation of this new relation to nature, that I became completely fascinated by that. And that everything that you create or do a project with people like that, you need to take the risk of exactly that unstableness, and that everything, almost all the projects, are based in something that conveys very badly with visuals, even badly with the language, because we still don't possess it, as you can sense. And then it's based on delicacy. So it's based really on immediate presence. And if you are not there to actually be there with the plant, it's very difficult for me to even try to convey the importance of that moment. And that is fundamental, because in this, there is something that I think resistance, because it's not that you cannot, it's that it just works badly into that context. It means something for that context. It means a challenge of the context. It means, as Rafael Montañez Ortiz was telling me once, that the only way to do a museum that would encompass properly the questions and the challenges of race and gender would be by becoming a rainforest. And this idea of not being able to control those practices interests me. It's very difficult to control those flowers. And these just examples, I can have many more. But in that, there is something that is a source, that is telling us about the future in ways that we need to listen and be attentive. And that is a really, it's a very complex situation that's going on there. So I was asked because I've been working a lot with archival practices. TVA 21, which is a foundation that deals, has a section of the foundation is dealing with what they call an academy, and this academy is producing and forming research around the relationship in between artists and scientists, producing expeditions, providing scholarships and fellowships for people to study together, to be together. So, you know, there is nothing radically experimental in it. It's just normal. It's the idea of putting people together, producing some sort of a think tank where you can actually exchange and also have access to these debates and research that scientists are conducting on the one hand, but also developing and producing new artworks on the other. And they have several ways of doing so. They have been producing many trips, seminars, encounters, exhibitions, publications, and so on and so forth. And then they came to me and said that they wanted to do a presentation of their archive, that they would like me to go through the archive, and perhaps because of what I was telling at the beginning, the Center of Research and Documentation, the idea that I've been working with that I'm very familiar with this material, that I really love it, that I produce a presentation of their archive. And then I said yes, without much thinking. And they sent to me, I think, something like 14 hard drivers of, I don't know, 700 hours of footage that they have been recording over these trips. And then I was completely speechless in the sense of how is this documentation on the one hand, what is this documentation disclosing, what is this documentation actually talking about, and actually how can this documentation be of interest, and if yes, how is the relation that we are going to create if we exhibit such a documentation in an art space or in an art context with the viewer. So are we actually selecting parts of this footage, and then you will see some endangered species, and then a piece of text would produce next to this footage, and then you go into protectiveness, and then I would encourage and motivate you to become aware that you should not damage the ocean, but you probably know that. So the question is, what is the adding part? Are we then really talking about nature if we are articulating our relation in an ecological sense? I think, is this an ecological nature, like the impulse of the behavior that we are kind of promoting when we would exhibit such a thing is telling protect the planet? And you should say that, protect the planet. But if you say protect the planet, we are saying it from our kind of point of view as humans. So it's already a position of knowing more, of knowing that we are actually damaging it, and we should also kind of give ourselves the mantra of protecting it. So if it's not ecology, and ecology is just a part of it because you don't want to like keep on destroying, but what is the material? Like, how can we actually talk about these oceans without being another exercise of controlling? Even if you want to, for a good reason, like positive controlling, if you want to say so. So I was like unable to go through all these hours, like, or to see, to distinguish into that. It would be like if you inherit, I don't know, some sort of national film archive or something like that. And everything is water, and everything is water with the sea. So how to actually make a distinction? I just discovered that I was not even able to find out the categories, and that the categories were the motivation of study. So they went into different seas, and this is one motivation, to discover and to monitorize certain parts of our seas and our planet on the one hand, and on the other, the second motivation was a relationship that we established what we are studying, which is the sea, but we are actually establishing through technology. So every time that they went into a trip, they were recording it in a different manner. So there was like many ways of taking those images. So it was not only actually about the oceans, but about this kind of mediation, how technology and how are we super dependent on the images that we get back from what we are doing. So it's one thing is the human into the water, like together with the fishes, and the other thing is also the technology and the mediations that you are building and the nature of all these images, that they were really different. So I decided to call an artist, Tiffany Moore, which is actually living in Paris, and ask her if she would actually, for almost a year, go through those images and produce a movie through that material. And she worked many hours to do so, and she could explain it much better than me. But the first thing that she was doing, and was very interesting, is that by separating the footage of those doing the footage from another person that was actually post-producing and acting into the footage produced by others, it was already an interesting separation. So we were not only giving you the footage as made by those cameras, but kind of trying to remove that intentionality. Try to get away of the intentionality of all those cameras filming the ocean in a second stage. So it's difficult to explain how it happened, but actually it kind of happened. So she was able to produce a movie, like a very large movie that was like 5 hours. And then we exhibited we presented it as a moving wall, like it was like a gigantic wall. I don't know if you can see it here, but you saw it in other images. And then when we are seeing those images, we were talking about them. And then, as I said, what we discovered is that all those images were actually about one thing. And that one thing is behavior. On the one side, the behavior of nature and the animals, but also the environments and the habitats. So the question of behavior, the behavior of the humans in the water, and how these two behaviors act, and then the behavior of those that are not in the water and that they are actually seeing the images of the ocean. So the question of behavior somehow became totally central. And then I was thinking that it would be very interesting, in order to present an archive, to go to a very traditional way of presenting it. Normally, you would present the documents in a vitrine, or preserving it, or displaying it, so that you would actually see the sources, or the photo, the sources of the archive. Then you would superimpose some sort of a text, and then that superimposition that leads you to read would kind of produce in you some new knowledge, or some ideas of what to memorize, or what to understand, of what you are seeing and reading at the same time. So I thought that it would be a really interesting way, since it's very difficult to put a text next to the oceans, to start interviewing people that they were actually mimes, that they are expert in behavior, probably from the most strange corner of my brain. But I was thinking that it would be very interesting to talk to people working in circuses, because it's a very unsteady practice, as the one that I was describing. And when they are acting in a production, normally it's not, a circus never maintains itself, so it's like very unsteady, it's changing all the time. And I was kind of starting interviewing those that they imitate movement, by trying to imitate the human behavior, which are the mimes. And then I discovered that there was a school in Switzerland that is a school of mime. And then I started to discover a whole substrate of schools and people dealing with that kind of old technique of imitating the human. And then I interviewed a couple, and it was super interesting to talk to them about the idea of what it is to imitate a human, and the kind of allergy that it also sometimes provokes in us when we see us replicated in our movements, in our body language. And if they were interested in imitating the ocean, and they said yes. And then Eduardo Navarro, this artist that I was mentioning at the beginning, produced a ballet, or produced like some sort of dresses, very simple. You are seeing them, which are black. And in the hands of the mimes, it was a mirror. And it was two reflectors that they were reflecting the light that they was apparently coming from the ocean, reflecting into the mirrors, reflecting into the hands. They were moving as the ocean was moving. And in parallel to that kind of text, I wanted a voice. And then I asked Shabnam Birmani, which is one of the most important woman filmmakers of India, that is an expert in documentary filmmaking, and that since 2005 she has been started singing Kabir, which is mystical poetry of the 15th century in India. To answer, and she has been starting singing in the classroom as a way of producing a substance to convey and to talk about film. If she would agree on singing next to that, and that was our archival display. So I just put a minute of it. So I've been talking for an hour, and I think that perhaps there is time for questions, and perhaps in the questions I'm able to summarize better some of the concerns and the ideas that I've been trying with difficulty to explain and trespass to you. But that was kind of my main practical example of the display of something which is documentary display, that I thought it relates also with the main subject of research and presentation or experiencing research into the public space.
Any questions? Do you want to pop up your hand and come to you? Maybe I'll start the ball rolling.
Yeah.
You said that you're working with these artists and there's a new type of practice. You mentioned, I think, that this was a kind of new thing of trying to become animal or become plant. But many of the stories that you have used as examples, I feel like there is already this thing that has been happening with Indigenous artists in Australia and Torres Strait Islands. And so I wondered if you do see that as a different type of work, or whether you're...
No, I say new in the context of our institutional practice, but definitely not new. And there is no trend. This is also not a revision. It's not that these artists, and that's very important, this new interest in nature is not departing from any will to revise a former non-relation with nature. Also, you need to understand that those artists may not be interested in nature, because what relates them to nature is not interest, in the sense that it's not curiosity, it's not, so it's also not the artist as the anthropologist, it's not the artist as the curious human, it goes beyond that, but I still think that we are missing a vocabulary there, and definitely yes, I think Indigenous artists have been much eloquent in actually merging, giving form to these relationships and their importance. But it is also our way of excluding those histories from exhibition making, but also thinking. I think they are uncritical, not because they are not intelligent, but because they are not in the tradition of the Enlightenment. So an interesting subject matter is the relationship or the implicit, let's say, critique, but critique would be too blank, or let's say, it's touching upon the limits of the Enlightenment and the question of the line, of how we actually encounter the knowledge. And we encounter the knowledge we think in the book, in the fact that we read. But this is one part of the story, and it's not all. So definitely in all those new for us somehow, in all these practices, there is an interest in discovering this non-linear possibility of transmission. But this is for Indigenous culture absolutely normal. But also it's normal for the hyperlink, it's normal for technology. So in one way, Indigenous culture is technological, and it's already expressing something that we wanted to to reach, but we had something in between, that's the book. So this is different from the book. And it's different from the object. It's different from these two things. And this is very difficult for us.
Yeah, I was wondering about the research components. How does that fit in? Because you could have, I mean, there's always some research, isn't there? So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, you are talking about the research of the artist?
Yeah, research of the artist.
Well, in the case, for example, of yeah, it's research-based in the sense that many of the works that I've been showing, it takes the artists at least 1 or 2 years to give them a form, and are very supported by what experts on the field know about what they are interested in, for example. So Ingela, that is she has been, for example, 1 year in a particular oceanic station, studying the plants and how they get actually the life of plants in the ocean, so to say. So yes, there is this part, but then it's true that when she exhibits her plants, there's nothing of it. So it's something that is in her, and she mostly discloses when she teaches. So if she's asked to do a seminar, then she would go through all the research that she has been doing. But if she is asked to be in an exhibition, then she does normally a performance where she dresses as a plant that it takes around 6 and 9 months to do, and then that she activates one night and leaves it open in the exhibition space. So still she separates that. So it's not present in the artwork, or if you don't know, you will not know. So if this answers, so you will not find a booklet next to it, or footage, or a film, but all of it exists. And it's also something that may change. I think that in her case, she's asking herself a lot about that, or how to, but does not want to do it in that very one-to-one situation as many artists. So how to convey or express that in a different form is very difficult.
Could you please explain more this ballet? How did you work? Did you work with experts of animals or ethologists? And how was the choreography was built?
No, the footage is made by mostly scientists and some artists that they were together with those scientists. So it's conducted with a goal. So they were studying things, and they were setting themselves goals, and they were just exploring certain parts, certain species, and they were like recording those trips of research. So that's the images. But then, again, like in the case of Ingela, if you are not an active part of that research, for our eyes, it's very difficult to see those intentions of that research. What you see, you don't even know what you are seeing. You need to have the scientist next to you, telling you what actually are you seeing. But you get to know it a little bit by hours and hours of it. But it demands really complete immersion. The second part was the idea of actually, since it's very unreadable, but you can experience it, and you really you really relate. So it's very relatable, all that as a substance, no? Because it's many hours, because it's like how it's done. There is something there that is kind of following a logic that you kind of get, even if you don't know exactly, if you are not an expert, which animals are you watching, or for what reason the camera is several hours into one subject, so it's difficult. The second thing was the idea of then what to do. If you cannot really read it as a text, could you learn? Could it be like a manifesto for a new behavior? I think apart from protecting or embracing the ocean, Could we learn to be it, or can we actually incorporate something of those movements into our body, or there is something of it that is relatable to us because we are up and we walk and they are down and they are underwater and we are not, and our normal environment is not water. I think if you are presenting it to a viewer in a museum or into an exhibition space, those people don't go into this kind of expedition. So of course it's a performance. So the performance was based on those people, like two mimes, that they were for many months studying the movements of animals in the ocean. So one of them is an expert in I don't know how to say it. It's like jellyfishes and octopuses and all these invertebrados, like all the non-bones, all these movements that happen. So he is like completely possessed by that, and he developed a number for the circus based on that. So he's not doing performance in the art context. He's performance for children and in the context of the circus. So it was actually my speculative idea to mix those. But then I realized that I could actually not move them myself. That I could not say to the mimes, behave like the ocean, like mimic it. Very traditional art history exercise, just mimic, copy. Like let's copy, like in traditional 16th century, like learning by copying. And then I needed an artist somehow, and then I asked Eduardo, and Eduardo was totally into it, and he conceived the ballet in the sense that he conceived the situation, like the mirrors and the lighting, and they were doing their movement. So he had a mechanical hand made, which is it's a hand that looks like another hand, and you could move, and it's full of mirrors. And then it was two reflectors coming, and they were like acting like in parallel to the screens, and they were moving, and then they were reflecting the light of those lights into the whole space. So a performance. And then somebody was singing at the same time, because there is no voice in the underwater. And I wanted to actually talk about filmmaking, and Shatnan is an amazing filmmaker, and she immediately understood that she could sing to that and address filmmaking by singing. But you know, it was just a complete speculative night. It only lasts for a night, and that was the idea of presenting the archive. Why I was doing it? The foundation that does lots of research normally produces conferences to display the research made by scientists, and also they invite the artists in the conference to present their work. But I was getting tired of people talking about subjects I could read about. And also I was again back to my old MACBA problem. The problem that those conducting the research having lots of fun, that the display of the documents was in direct opposition of the production of exhibitions. So they commission artworks and they do beautiful exhibitions with those artworks. And then if you are asked to deal with knowledge, then you go into a self-imposed academic format. But there is nothing, you know, academia is not the only bottle for knowledge or for ideas on intelligence. So why are we taking that format? We take that format because it's easy, because you would understand, it's easy to convey, it describes what you did, it justifies, it's a social and political accepted format. But it's not the only one. So it was for me just interesting to explore the possibility of a complete different format that at the end was also dealing with the archive. This is not less archival than a vitrine, but it's different. So that was my motivation, I think.
Yeah, thank you for all this. I had a question about, you seem to imply, when you talked about the limits of the Enlightenment and touching on the limits of the Enlightenment, you seem to imply that science and indigenous cultures, but that I understand better, science has a way of touching on the limits of the Enlightenment, of getting out of certain paradoxes of the Enlightenment, whilst critique and philosophy is still very much entrenched, which is something that I'm very sensitive to. I was just wondering how they do that, or how you see that in science, and what are the ways out?
No, but when I'm saying about science, or what scientists are telling me, is that they are in a deep crisis. As you know, like Donald Trump is cutting exactly match of the science programs as he is from the National Endowment of the Arts. So when I'm talking about scientists, I'm talking about those super speculative minds that define institutionalized science, and they are trying to surpass and go into experiments and ways of acting that then get financed by the military normally. So it's also super tricky and problematic. But yes, there is an ambition in science still, in a little bit of science, that is very extravagant and very daring, and I think that we lost it a little bit on that. Not that we did not have it, but I don't perceive it that much. Because also there is a logic for it. I think science has a different publicness than museums or than the art world. The art world is ultra exposed. So the preserved spaces for this level of speculation are very few. So in the public, it's difficult to do. So what they are defying is not because they want to defy, it's because their ambition into the questioning and the articulation of the material is really, it goes beyond something that is aimed to be taught or is aimed to be justified. So in the very moment that any of us would be out of that, of transmission, and out of justification or giving it a public form, we also would probably be extravagant. But there is very few. I think what they are complaining is that if this was possible, now it's becoming almost impossible. So and if it's made possible, like David Gruber, he was explaining to us that the only financing that you find is the military.
And when you say that they're defiant to that kind of construction, the Enlightenment and all of that, are you talking about like limits of linear thinking? That's what you mentioned before,
No.
or judgment in itself?
No, I think that there is something that there is in common in science, but science, like very particular chapter, small science and science, very small corner of science, is fascinated by the life of perception and how perception really challenges and reformats the way that we understand, the way we think, and so on. So our organs. And I do think that art at its core is really it. I think that the main ambition of art is really getting perception to realms where it has never been. So this traveling into a frog is traveling into the worlds of perception. I don't think that she is interested in becoming a frog. It's not magic, it's not impersonation, it's not theater. It's actually touching upon the question of perception, as different as from experience. And in this, there is an immense potential, because also technology is very interested in perception. And perception is, is something that is modifying behavior. So that's why I think that there is a level of connectivity, but how to talk about it is it's very difficult. But everyone is talking about behavior, and then we are not. I think those mimes are imitating the ocean, but I think if you just go to I don't know where, the Torre Eiffel, probably people is imitating themselves by imitating the Torre Eiffel by putting themselves into a selfie. So there is already this idea of the archiving of the self-image as a mime into the selfies. So all those millions of tourists, like mimicking that, so this is it, but just with monuments, with idea of the memorabilia. So it's an interesting transferring of what behavior is and what behavior says about perception. And it needs to say something, because they cannot be a bunch of idiots. I completely think they are not. So they are doing that not only because they want the photo, but they want that movement. They want that body seriously to an But where to put it, where to place it in theory, I still don't know.
Thank you.
I was just curious. There was like a third stage on the scientific research after you did this perception speculative experiment in an exhibition space with different agents, like interpreting or perceiving the footage and the scientific recordings. There was, yeah,
Yes,
it
was.
went back to the scientific experiment.
Yes, it was. So it was like some sort of a starting experience that was also accompanied the day after by a normal conference. So presenting the research. Because it would be very difficult to convince the scientists to sing. But you know what I mean? I think still you go back to the formats that you know about talking about what you did. So, but I was impressed how happy everyone was about that, because many understood that it would be really interesting to explore the notion of conveying. But of course we are coming from the artistic, so it's a performance, but it's an archive and it's documentary material. So it's not an artwork. It's different. It still is different from it. Did I answer? I didn't.
Did you change something on the research itself? Like, did the scientists?
They say yes,
something
but
else?
yeah, well, yes and no. I think, of course, my surprise is by working together, how many yeses you get, how many people really want to work with us. So it already shows that it must be a commonality, otherwise they would not come. But on the other hand, I don't know how much we can challenge scientific methods, and I don't know if the idea is to challenge. But yes, they see things. But it was very interesting that David Gruber said that for him it's fundamental to work with artists, because he's not understanding many things about that eye, because that eye has no body, it's just a camera, and he needs a body. And because he needs a body, working with artists make him understand how the body works. And he is basically, and his lab is working with artists, and is also inviting and watching artistic material a lot, even historical, because for them the question of the performing of technology is fundamental. But it is fundamental for us. It's only that we see it all separate, like from each other.
Then I actually have perhaps one last final question, so thinking about art as intelligence and this relationship between behavior, perception, and then the impact on possible scientific methods, for instance. I was wondering also about what kind of thoughts in this process you had about the relationship between art as intelligence, but in the context of institutional methods, since here we're also testing the limits, the framework of art institutions and so on. How does that might impact?
Yeah, there's always something I never explained, which is the actual motivation of doing that. So the actual motivation of doing that is to actually see new ways of addressing the question of race and gender, so that it's not ecological, that they are not based on protection, that we kind of reach a total coexistence. So there is an interest in gender that is kind of there, but I cannot describe it yet. But all of it is motivated by that. And I do think that the institutional grammar is not able, but it's the one, because we inherited. It's like, you know, it's something that we have, and it's a great thing to have. But one thing is, institutions are there to defend. So they are there to preserve, they are there to defend. So they cannot actually be the motors, they cannot be the speculative drive of the things. And the challenges are overimposed in them, and they take them only partly. And it's probably a good thing. So to challenge the institutions, for me, is nothing that I think yes and no, but it would challenge it, yes. But if yes, by osmosis, like Peralta Ramos. then it would only kind of reach a level that the permeability in between the outside of what they are capable of absorbing and the inside is so radically there that then they need. So it's softened or something happened, but it's not going to challenge or being changed, I think, by demands. So it is a practice, and the practice happens inside, and it needs to happen inside, but also outside. But it's also more than that practice. It's something that goes beyond. And the question is, what other places do we have which are not so institutionalized that they are, because an institution is like furniture, so not everything is furniture. And of course it's good to have it in design, to have new forms, new colors, more softened, more, but still it's there to encompass the memory of certain traditions. And the question is, how do they relate to air, to atmosphere, to something different from them? So I am, on the one hand, very pragmatic about what they are, and we can do choreographies and so on, but we need also other spaces. And that's a very important political question, because those other spaces are really endangered. It's not that we have many. It's not that we have many public money. It's not that we have many other spaces. It's not that the spaces is even the word, because it's not about space. But it is, because that's the imagination of communality. So the question is, where can we be together doing those types of things that we think enlarge our view on what culture is doing upon the social? So yes, this is a major question, but I think that these institutions are just small players into the totality, but it's true. And that's what I think, that the ocean, that so many people are going to nature, it has to do also with the crisis. So in an intuitive way, many artists are sensing that it's super important to expand and get liberated. So this new interest also responds to a liberation from the tides of the institutional practices, of the framing of the art world. How is its institutional life, its public life, its Western life, and all the problems that it encompasses. So there is an interest of, let's call it, there is also some new pioneering, like searching for the hope of your own discipline into something that has nothing to do with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.